All right, so we're going to go ahead and start. And those of you who are joining us a little bit late will just join us as they come in. So I'd like to welcome you all to our Lunch and Learn series. Obviously, I am with the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough. I'm Annie Newton. I am the Program and Development Director there. And we'd like to welcome you to this series that we're doing this summer with the Burwell School, or highlighting the Burwell School. Today, we've got Brooks Graebner, who is talking with us about St. Matthew's and the history of the church. So Brooks, thank you so much for doing this for us. I want to quickly give just a rundown for those of you who are new to Zoom. My guess is that none of you are new to Zoom, but just in case, how it's going to work today, we cannot see or hear you. But if you have any questions, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's going to be a Q&A box right down there. And so you can type in anything that you need. If you cannot hear at some point or the video cuts out or something like that, please feel free to type that in there. I will monitor that throughout the talk today. And then you can also add any questions you've got for Brooks. We're going to save the questions for the end, but if you think of anything while Brooks is talking, feel free to type it down there and we will get to it at the end of the session. So, and we encourage as many questions and as wide a variety of questions as you've got. And so we'd like this to be as interactive as you possibly want it to be. And so again, the way this is going to work today is you're going to be able to see Brooks. I'm going to share his PowerPoint. And so it's going to look a little bit different than some of the other webinars maybe you've seen. You'll still be able to see him, but you'll also be able to see my screen. So Brooks, I'd like to welcome you here. Brooks is the rector emeritus of St. Matthew's, where he served from 1990 to 2017. Since 2007, he has been the historiographer, which is the word for an official historian for the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina, a position which he still holds. He has been active in supporting local historical organizations, including serving on the boards of the Historical Foundation, the Preservation Fund, and the Burwell School. He holds degrees from the University of Virginia, Duke University, and Virginia Theological Seminary, and he has taught church history at Duke Divinity School, UNC Chapel Hill, and Wake Forest Divinity School. Brooks, will forgive you for being involved with Duke. It's a great school, but I do not like their basketball team. So without further ado, Brooks, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you all for joining this afternoon's Lunch and Learn. And I have some folks with me here at St. Matthew's. I'm filming this from the Cook Lawrence room of the parish house at St. Matthew's. And also with me in the room are my successor, the Robert Fruworth. Robert, thank you for being here this afternoon. And also in the screen with Robert, you can see Elaine Brusido. Elaine is the head of the archives committee here at St. Matthew's and the person who actually has the custody of the Parish Register that we're going to be talking about. So Elaine is also responsible for preparing many of the slides that I will be showing, which feature snippets of the Parish Register. So Elaine, thank you for all that you have done in advance. And also with me are two Duke Divinity School interns, Katie Bracey, who is, I think, a rising third-year student at the Divinity School and is doing field education work this summer here at St. Matthew's, and Hope Anderson, who is the master of the technology in this room, which is very impressive, and I'm so appreciative of their being here as well. So I have been asked to speak specifically about a particular resource, a primary document from St. Matthew's, which is called the Parish Register. And so this is the Parish Register that we're going to be talking about. It is here. It says Parish Register of St. Matthew's Church, Hillsborough, North Carolina, 1824 to 1881. So I thought we might begin by simply asking the question, what is a parish register? So if you can start that up, Annie, we'll go to the PowerPoint.
All right, starting right now. Just give me 1 second to figure out the technology. Hold on.
All right. So, what is a parish register? Let's go to slide 2. It is a record of solemn acts. It contains records of baptisms, confirmations, marriages, and burials that are done in the parish. It is also a record of member status. It's a list of the baptized members and the communicant members of the parish. For those of you who may not be familiar with those terms, the list of baptized members are everybody who is baptized here at St. Matthew's, or people who have been baptized elsewhere and then subsequently join St. Matthew's. Now, in the Episcopal Church, we practice what is known as infant baptism. So in addition to baptism, we have a second sacramental rite, which we call confirmation. And you have to be of age to speak for yourself in order to be confirmed. And confirmation is a sacramental rite that is only done by the bishop. So it's a very big deal in the life of the parish when people are confirmed. And then that is the requirement in order to take the sacrament of Holy Communion. So the communicant members are members of the church who, in addition to being baptized, have gone through a second sacramental rite, the rite of confirmation. And only then are they admitted to Holy Communion and become communicant members. So one way to think about it is the communicant members are a subset of the baptized members, a smaller group within the total list of baptized members. And communicant members are all going to be at least of an age at which they can speak for themselves, and will have gone through a preparatory period in which they have learned the catechism and they have learned the 10 Commandments and the Lord's Prayer and the creeds. The other thing that is recorded in a parish register are notable parish events, and some registers even include a history section. So a parish register is an incredibly important document for the life of any Episcopal congregation. Along with vestry minutes, the register is one of the two most important sources of information about a congregation. So, Annie, we can just flip back to my, and allow me to just show people just a little bit about what the pages of this book look like. So here is a page that records baptisms, and all the baptisms are listed in chronological order. Here's a section for all the marriages, and again in chronological order. So these are incredibly important records, both for the life of the church, but they can also be very, very important records for the lives of the individuals in terms of documenting births, marriages, baptisms. So they include a lot of personal information, which can be very valuable if you're doing genealogical research. So back to the slideshow, please, Anne.
I'm trying. Just give me 1 second.
Of course. So, the question comes up, who actually is responsible for maintaining these records? And the answer to that question is the minister who is in charge of the congregation is the person who has custody of the parish register and is responsible for maintaining the parish register. So while I was the rector of St. Matthew's, I was responsible for maintaining the parish register, but I have terrible handwriting, so I assign to others the task of writing in exactly what happened, and then I would just add my signature, which seemed like a very sensible way to do it. As you can imagine, these books start as blank books. There are no writing on the pages until the ministers start writing in them. The quality of parish register is dependent upon the minister taking the responsibility seriously and making sure the documentation is properly done. As we'll see in some of the snippets, there are times and places where sometimes a name is missing, where there are misspellings. And, so it's really important to do this as well as you possibly can. But of course, mistakes and omissions do inevitably occur.
Brooks, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I think I should be live with the screen share now. We just had a second of technology issues, but it should be back live. If someone cannot see it, please let me know. But we are back with the slideshow.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay. So St. Matthew's is now about to start its 5th parish register. But today we want to talk about just the first register. So next slide, please. So this is what that first parish register used to look like when I was the rector. But in 2018, the book was beautifully restored, and this is what it looks like now. So next slide. So kudos to Robert and Elaine and everybody involved with the restoration of this book. So thank you very much for being good stewards of this invaluable record. So let's get into the ministers who maintained this first parish register. So here are the folks who were responsible for the first parish register. The founding rector was William Mercer Green, who was in charge of the congregation from 1824 to 1838. And then Henry Proof came in 1838 and stayed a few years. But he's very important because Mercer Green did not actually maintain the parish register. He kept a personal register, and fortunately, he lent it to Henry Proof to transcribe into the parish register the materials related to St. Matthew's. And we have to hope that Henry Proof did a good job, because the original personal register of William Mercer Green is no longer extant. Anyway, after Proof comes M.A. Curtis, who served 2 terms as rector, first from 1841 to 1847. Then he moved to South Carolina, and a young man named James B. Donnelly was rector until 1855, when he died suddenly as a young man. And then Curtis was invited to come back and serve the congregation until his death in 1872. And in the spring of 1872, Curtis's son, Charles Curtis, was just finishing up seminary in New York City. And so the congregation, with the bishop's blessing, made arrangements for Charlie Curtis to succeed his father. And so there's a couple of months between April and June where the congregation did not have a minister. And then when Charles Curtis graduated from seminary, he was ordained and became in charge of the congregation following his father. So turn to the next slide, please, Annie. And you can see the various handwritings there. So the first is an entry from Henry Proof from September of 1838, where he talks about the fact that he is copying from the record kept by the Reverend William Mercer Green while he was rector of St. Matthew's Church. Then you can see Curtis's handwriting. And just note that above every name, someone has written in a number, 264, 265, above William Owen and Emma Moore, children of Dr. William and Mrs. Emma Cameron. That's because, and you'll see this in just a second, the fellow who took custody of the parish in 1881, Joseph Murphy, wanted to have a complete list of all the baptisms. And so he assigned them numbers. And so you can see down in the next under Reverend James B. Donnelly, rector, it says May 14th, Anna and Walker, colored children property of Mrs. J. Cameron. Okay, and again, there are numbers there above their names. And then you can see Charlie Curtis's handwriting there at the bottom. So let's go on to the next slide. The organization indexing of the first parish register was completed by Charles Curtis's successor, the Reverend Joseph W. Murphy, in 1881. So let's turn to the next slide. And he very helpfully created a master index of this register. There was this list of the communicants whose names are recorded in this book with notes as to their identity, etc. And then he starts in 1824, and he starts listing all the communicant members of the church in the order in which they appear in the book, which is an enormously helpful resource if you're trying to find out quickly whose name is in the book. So let's go on to the next slide. And then he made a general summary. Having carefully put all those numbers above everybody's name, he then said baptisms recorded in this book, deducting, because a couple of people got entered twice, there were 638 baptisms. No, let's go back to that slide. Thank you. And confirmations, of whom males 62, communicants, of whom males 85. What you can see here is that the communicant number is less than half of the total baptized number. And that reflects what we were talking about earlier, that the communicant number is a smaller number than the baptism number. In this case, a little less than half. Okay, now we can move on in. Thank you. Now, this is a very interesting list that Murphy made. It's the colored communicant list. And he says in all, there were only 10 African-American communicants. Now, I think that number is a little on the small side, but it's close. And you can see that on this list are 10 names. And actually the last name on this list it goes beyond the dates of the parish register itself. Robert Lee Nichols is listed as having become a communicant in 1883, but the book actually only goes through 1881. So this scrap of paper is included with the parish register, but clearly was made separately. So now we will move on. Now, because the parish register clearly identifies people by race, it is fairly easy to go through the parish register and figure out who the African-American members of the church were. And so 20 years ago, I sat down with this book and page by page, I made a transcription of the entries of all of the African-American records in the book. And you can see how they are listed. It is the standard reference is to give a first name only, a brief description, and then say who enslaved them. So just reading off the first. Henry, infant son of Sarah, property of Mrs. M.R. Anderson. Mrs. M.R. Anderson is the sister of Duncan Cameron. Colin William, infant son of William and Betty, property of Mr. W.E. Anderson. That was Mary Anderson's son, William, who, so just kind of, we could read down. One of the things I'll point to, and I'll come back to it in just a minute, is the fact that this also includes members of the household of the minister, William Mercer Green. So if we go down, for example, to May 19th, 1833, Peter, Celia, Anne, Robert, children of Levi and Jenny, property of Reverend William Mercer Green, baptized by Bishop Ives, parents and Reverend William Mercer Green sponsors. So among the records here are the records of enslaved members of the household of the ministers. Okay. Now, go to the next slide. So one of the things that having that list allowed me to do then was to count up exactly how many African-American baptisms there were at St. Matthew's during the time of this record. So we know there were 550 or so baptisms, and we know that 142 of those, over 25%, were African-Americans. So what this means, to state the obvious, is that St. Matthew's before 1865 was biracial. There were white and black members of this church. St. Matthew's today is overwhelmingly white, but that was not always the case. Most of those whose names are recorded were enslaved members of the households of white church members. Which means if you want to know more, you have to go to census records or wills or personal papers or newspaper accounts, because as you saw earlier, these enslaved people are mentioned only and identified only by first name in most instances. Now, the presence of Black members, go back to the previous slide, please, Annie. Now, the presence of Black members reflects the official position of the church regarding baptism and catechetical training for the enslaved. Slave evangelization was viewed as the duty of Christian enslavers, who were enjoined to take responsibility for the spiritual as well as the physical life of those they enslaved. So these records, such as that list that you see on the left-hand side, tell us more about the mindset of the enslavers than about the enslaved, especially where baptism is concerned, because usually the members of the white family were the sponsors. So we know that they thought of themselves as fulfilling their own solemn Christian duty by bringing the children of their enslaved members to church and having them baptized. And they also encouraged the members, the enslaved members of their household to learn the catechism. So the Cameron and Collins families, for example, were very invested in religious instruction for those they enslaved, to the extent that they actually built chapels on their property and engaged ministers to come and teach the enslaved. These are folks who wanted to see themselves and to be seen by others as fulfilling the responsibilities for Christian slaveholding. And William Mercer Green, in addition to serving this parish, went every month to the plantation chapel at Farintosh, which is now in northern Durham County, and conducted monthly services for the enslaved community there. And unfortunately, those records are not extant. Now, if African Americans were confirmed or married by the clergy, then we can assume that their own volition played a greater role. In this case, you would have to speak for yourself. and you would have to undergo preparatory steps, such as learning to recite the Catechism, the Creed, the Ten Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer. Not surprisingly, then, the list of Black communicants is a much smaller number, but the names that appear as Black communicants of this church are names of folks who are highly, highly significant. So let's go forward a couple of slides, please, Annie. Okay, so remember we saw this list just a minute ago, and we have 10 names there. And this morning, what I would like to do is highlight for you the significance of 3 of the names. The first being next to the year 1834, the name Job. Then 1842, the name Henry Evans. And then 1866, the name Cornelia. So who are these folks? And what else do we know about them? So go on to the next slide, Annie. So in 1833, we see it says Job, colored adult, property of G.W.B. Bergman. And then the next year, under confirmations, 1834, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people who were confirmed by the bishop in April of 1834. And they include again, down there near the bottom, Job, colored, property of George W.B. Bergman. And you can see right below that and above that are 2 other persons who are confirmed at the same time as Job. Jenny, who's a member of William Mercer Green's household, and Minerva, who's a property of priestly Magna. Okay? Magna. So, what's interesting is that a member of this congregation and a member of the research committee at Burwell, Betty Eidner, was able, through some wonderful historical sleuthing, to identify Job as none other than an important Black leader here in Hillsborough in the Reconstruction era, named Job Berry. So let's go on to the next slide. So we know that in 1842, it says Job/colored was removed in 1842. Removed almost always means they stopped living in Hillsborough. Okay. Now, what we know is that, thanks to Betty's research, is that Job was assigned by George Bergman to look after George's young son, who was sent to Hillsborough and later to Chapel Hill as a student. And so Job was there to be a guardian and supporter and personal servant to Bergman's young son. But when young Bergman finished at Chapel Hill, Job was allowed to return to Hillsborough and ends up in the employ of a local, very significant builder and architect named John Berry, and goes to work for John Berry as a painter, and takes the last name Berry. And he then, in 1865, as you'll see in the next slide, that Job Berry, in September of 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War, is inviting others to join him in trying to raise money to establish a freedmen's school here in Hillsborough. We also know that Job Berry, in addition to making this pilgrimage from being an enslaved member of the Bergman household to being in the employ of John Berry. We also know that at some point in the 1850s, Joe Berry begins to take on a role in Hillsborough as a religious leader. And shortly after this notice, Joe Berry is licensed as a preacher in the African Methodist Episcopal denomination. And he is considered one of the founders of Dickerson Chapel AME here in Hillsborough. So Joe Berry goes from being a communicant at St. Matthew's to becoming a minister in the AME denomination. So that's Joe Berry. And if you want to know more about Joe Berry, just look at the task force report in the Biblical School, which is on the Biblical School website, and you can see all the great research that Betty Heidner did about Joe Berry and his family. So let's move on to person number 2. Next slide, please. Next person I want to talk about is Henry Evans. Now, Henry Evans is a free person of color. He is not enslaved. He lives down on Margaret Lane, and he is a furniture maker. And he has his shop on Turpin Street across from the old courthouse. And in 1842, August 28th, and remember there are all those numbers counting up everybody who's baptized, number 275, it says Henry Evans, and again with the parentheses, colored. And because all these people are adults, they are listed not as having sponsors, but as having witnesses to their baptism. So John Bailey, Priestley Mangum, Catherine Mangum, and Henry Evans, 4 adults, were all baptized on August 28th. And when you see the next slide, you'll understand the significance of that particular date. Because on the same date, they are confirmed. Now, you have to be baptized in order to be confirmed. So in this case, all these folks were baptized earlier on the same day that they are confirmed by the bishop. And you can see there, the 108th confirmation take place at St. Matthew's is Henry Evans. And here he is noted as being a free person of color. Okay? So on to the next slide. So there he is in the communicant list, Henry Evans, free colored, and it says removed April 1854. Before that removal, down below, we see that Henry and his wife Henrietta have had their child Julia Frances baptized here. And that says parent sponsors, because Julia is an infant. And so you're sponsored for baptism if you're an infant, and your baptism is witnessed if you're an adult. Okay? So back up here it says April 1854 removed. So Henry Evans and his family and his extended family all leave North Carolina in April of 1854 and move as a family, as an extended family unit. They move to Ohio, and they settle in Oberlin. And Oberlin is a hotbed of abolitionist activity. And what makes Henry Evans especially fascinating is that in Oberlin in the late 1850s, Henry Evans is caught up in and becomes one of the prominent leaders of the abolitionist activity in Oberlin. So it's a little hard to zoom in on this, but I'm holding a book called The Town That Started the Civil War by Nat Brandt. And here's what it says on the back word of the book. Before the war between the states, there was the war between the US government and Oberlin, Ohio. Now, you can't see it, but on the front cover of this book, sitting in the picture on the front cover of this book, is none other than the same Henry Evans, whose records you see on the screen in front of you. Because Henry Evans was involved in a notorious case in which a slave catcher, a team of slave catchers, enters Oberlin, Ohio, to repossess a runaway enslaved person. This enrages the community of Oberlin. And the folks who have now claimed this black man in Oberlin go to the next town over, Wellington, which is where the train is. And they hole up in the hotel in Wellington, waiting for the train. Meanwhile, the citizens of Oberlin en masse run down and protest and try to rescue this black man from the custody of the slave catchers. And so if you've ever seen the movie 3:10 to Yuma, it's kind of like that. They actually mount a raid up the back staircase of the hotel, and they physically seize this black man from the slave catchers who were holding him in custody, and they whisk him out of town back to Oberlin, and then out of Oberlin across Lake Erie into Canada. Well, the Buchanan administration is so outraged by this open defiance of the fugitive slave law that they bring about 18 of these men up for trial, and they imprison them in Cleveland. And then it becomes very clear that they can't get a conviction. You can't get a jury in Cleveland to convict citizens of Ohio for rescuing someone from the clutches of the fugitive slave law. And so these folks all become celebrities of the abolitionist movement. And so here was Henry Evans, who once sat in the pews of St. Matthew's alongside slave owners, now becoming a very, very prominent public figure in the abolitionist movement. So another fascinating person whose story is recorded here in the Parish Register. So that brings us to the third person I'd like to mention, who is Cornelia. So next slide. Cornelia, it turns out, let me do one more thing about Henry Evans. You'll see that in the index that Joseph Mercy created, he says Henry Evans, three-colored, maker of chancel furniture, removed April 54. Now, we don't think we have much or any of that chancel furniture. It was replaced later in the 1880s and 1890s, unfortunately. But they may have one or two chairs that he made that look like they would be the sort of thing that by age and design could be Henry Evans chairs. But if you want to see more of Henry Evans' handiwork, you have to go up to Oberlin, where he and his brother opened a shop and also continued to make furniture. So I heartily wish we had all of Henry Evans' chancel furniture, and we could proudly display it here. But we will honor what we do have. Okay, now on to Cornelia. So if you can read down here the second entry, it says Mary Pauline, age 7 months, infant daughter of Robert G. and Cornelia Fitzgerald, colored, mother, sponsor. So Cornelia is Cornelia Fitzgerald. And Cornelia is the grandmother of Pauline Murray. And Cornelia was taken to church by her aunt, who was also the person who enslaved her, Mary Ruffin Smith. And she attended the Chapel of the Cross in Chapel Hill in the 1850s. And then Cornelia married Robert Fitzgerald, and Robert Fitzgerald was the school teacher. He was a Black man from Pennsylvania who came south to teach in the Freedman School in Hillsborough. So Cornelia and Robert Fitzgerald lived in Hillsborough, and Cornelia then had her first child, Mary Pauline, age 7 months, infant daughter, baptized here at St. Matthew's in 1872. And Mary Pauline Fitzgerald was then the aunt of Polly Murray. Polly Murray is named for her Aunt Pauline, and her Aunt Pauline subsequently became her adopted mother after the death of Polly's own mother, Agnes. So for a period of time, the Fitzgerald family were members of St. Matthew's. So go on to a couple more slides. Let's see the next one. So back at the Chapel of the Cross, Charlie Curtis saw to the baptism of Maria Louisa, daughter of Robert and Cornelia. That baptism is actually recorded in 2 places. It's recorded at the Chapel of the Cross and here in the records of St. Matthew's. And then, next slide, please. And we have a third child of Robert and Cornelia Fitzgerald being baptized in 1876. So after 1877, and a few years after this, the family moves to Durham, and Polly Murray's family story is then connected to Durham, and first to St. Philip's Parish, and then to St. Titus Parish. And just last night, we had a Polly Murray diocesan celebration at St. Titus. So thought I would close the presentation by reading you what Polly Murray in her classic book, Proud Shoes, has to say about the baptism of Aunt Pauline at St. Matthew's. From the moment of birth, Aunt Pauline was a bone of contention between grandmother Cornelia and the Fitzgeralds. As the first grandchild born in the South, she embodied the hopes of a stubborn clan, which had chosen to swim against a terrific backwash of history and yet refused to go under. She was blessed with a remarkable physical constitution and a practical wisdom, which became more evident as she grew older. Her Fitzgerald elders idolized her, and often grandmother Cornelia had to raise a row to get control over her own child. There had come to be much backbiting between grandmother and her younger Fitzgerald in-laws. They were freeborn and had a mite of Northern education, while grandmother had to admit she was born in slavery and could not prove her parentage. Such things made a great difference in those days and only made grandmother work the harder at impressing her children with the fact of their Smith forebears. In line with her own training, she was determined to bring them up as Episcopalians, although grandfather was a Presbyterian. She won the first round when she had her first child christened Mary Pauline Fitzgerald at the White Episcopal Church in Hillsborough by Dr. Curtis, its rector. So I hope that introduces you to the treasure that is the First Parish Register of St. Matthew's, and some of the stories and why it is also a significant source of information and a deep and important connection to African American history. Thank you.
Brooks, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating and really, really interesting. Just so you all know, I have written down the 2 books that Brooks mentioned, The Town That Started the Civil War and then Proud Shoes, which a lot of you probably already know, but I will send that out. So we're recording this, and once we've edited the video, we'll just cut off the beginning. When I send that out, I will also send out the titles of those 2 books if anyone is interested. We're now going to open everything up for questions. We have some questions that have already started coming in. So if you have questions, if you see that little box at the bottom, if you click that, that will pull up the question box, and you can write your question in there. So our first question is, did those who were baptized, were they done by choice, or was this a certain requirement of the church or their owner?
Well, I think very little volition went into the baptism, especially of infant enslaved people. So I think, as I think I tried to emphasize when I was talking, this is much more reflective of the mind and the mindset and the desires of the enslavers rather than the enslaved. Of course, that does not mean that these actions were without significance in the personal lives of those who were in fact brought here and baptized, and wanted to show that clearly in the case of folks like Henry Evans and Joe Barry, who clearly took away from their membership at St. Matthew's some important religious convictions, which they then continued to carry out. And one thing that's interesting about Henry Evans is he leaves Hillsborough as an Episcopalian, as a member of St. Matthew's. And when he goes to Oberlin, he first joins the Episcopal Church in Oberlin, and is actually a member of the vestry of the Oberlin Episcopal Church. So clearly being an Episcopalian was important to Henry Evans, and he carried that with him at a point where he certainly did not have to continue to be an Episcopalian. Everybody else in Oberlin was a Congregationalist. It was a town dominated by the Congregational Church. And after this Oberlin-Wellington raid, Henry Evans ceases to be a member of the Episcopal Church, and he becomes a founding member of the Second Congregational Church in Oberlin.
That's really interesting, and it says a lot about what Evans felt about his faith, that he yeah, that's fascinating. I did have a question. So my question for you is, when you were working with the register, was there anything that you found that surprised you? Was there anything in there that you weren't expecting?
I think until I actually went through the record, I did not fully appreciate the extent to which slave evangelization and the baptism of the enslaved took place at St. Matthew's. I was surprised when I realized that 25% of the baptized members of this church, 1 in 4 members of this church, were African American.
Yeah,
and of course, what happens is after the Civil War, when blacks are given the opportunity, the freedom to establish their own congregations and make those decisions for themselves, the overwhelming number ceased to be Episcopalian.
That's interesting. As a mixed congregation, do we know if there was segregation within the church, as we see in the burial grounds? Meaning, was there a separate seating area or restrictions in participating in activities?
Yes to both of those things. Yeah, and I thank you. That's a great question. So in 1836, 37, something like that, William Mercer Green had a gallery erected at St. Matthew's, which is still there, and was explicitly set aside for African Americans. So there was segregated seating in the church itself. And of course, St. Matthew's was not unique in this, in creating a spatial segregation. And of course, that becomes, a practice of, in the Jim Crow era, where again, separate seating for whites and blacks. But you see this early on at St. Matthew's. Now, what's interesting is that gallery is not built until 1836 or 1837, when we know that, for example, Job was a communicant of the church and was coming to church with young Mr. Bergman before that time. And I think we assume that he was, at least in that early period of time, sitting with the rest of the family. So one of the things that we can track through the antebellum period is how practices that were fairly informal in the first half of the antebellum period become hardened. And for example, it's not, before 1830, it's not illegal to teach the enslaved to read. After 1830, it is. Before 1835, free blacks are allowed to vote in North Carolina. After 1835, that is stripped away. So these records and these practices, I think, reflect changes that are going on in Southern society. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Is the register available in a digital form?
It is. It has been digitized, and if you want access to it, you need to get in touch with Elaine Druzido here at St. Matthew's, who can make the register available for further research.
Okay. And if you need her information, you can always email me too, and I can get you in touch with Elaine. And then the last question.
She's a wonderful, helpful person. And again, all those slides that show snippets from the Parish Register, Elaine prepared all of those. So it's wonderful to be part of a community that's very supportive of this kind of work.
Yeah. And then the last question is, what do these registers, what do they tell us about Hillsborough itself?
Well, they, along with, for example, the registers of the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church and the Presbyterian Church, we get to have a larger sense of how these families were intermarried or interacted and who were the members of which church. And so they help to build a picture of Hillsborough. And you get a sense of just how many members there were at St. Matthew's at any given time. So yeah, that can tell us a great deal about the history of the community, but they're especially helpful if you read them alongside the records of the other churches. One of the things that makes Hillsborough very, very distinctive is how many antebellum church buildings, that is, church buildings begun before 1861, are not only extant, but are still used by active congregations, which is just kind of just remarkable. It was kind of an aha moment for me when I realized that was the case. The Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, and of course Dickerson Chapel only became used as a church after the Civil War, but that building is actually the oldest of them because it's actually the third courthouse. So you've got 5 congregations worshiping in buildings all built before 1860. And
It is. Go ahead.
Is it? Yeah.
I was going to say, it's always amazing to me how many churches there are in Hillsborough, considering how small the population has been. I mean, it is growing, but for a long time, it was fairly stagnant at a few thousand people. And it is amazing how many churches there are and how important faith has been to the town. Really really cool.
Yeah.
Brooks, thank you so much for your time. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this, which I know everybody did, this is part of a larger series for the Lunch and Learns for the summer. It's an annual thing that we do, that the Alliance does every summer. And if you get on Eventbrite where you signed up for this, you can sign up for the rest throughout the summer. The next one will be in July. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. You can always email me, and I can always pass on questions or anything like that to Brooks. St. Matthew's staff, Robert, Hope, Elaine, thank you guys so much for all of your time. And again, Brooks, this was just absolutely fascinating and wonderful. It's always amazing to me just how much stuff is out there if you look for it, and where we can find, all of this data that's kind of hidden in a way. So this was really interesting, and I'm sure now everyone's going to go out and go to their own churches and try to look at their registers to see what's in there too. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day. This is recorded. We will send it out probably early next week as my guess. And again, I will include the 2 names of the books that Brooks mentioned if you're interested in getting those. I did check, they are both available on Amazon. So thank you again. Have a wonderful afternoon. And Brooks, this was the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Manny, and thank you all.
Bye.